Quick, say your spicy stuff now.
Okay, all right. So it's the February 13th, 2020 meeting for Service APIs. The first topic is basically, I think Damien, you mentioned that basically it would be useful, I think we discussed on Slack, it would be useful to have like office hours to kind of make faster progress, not just these weekly meetings. I think that's a good idea. We have to figure out the time that works for everyone, so I'll send out some email coordinating that. And then in sort of along with that was like, we should probably just have like a shared whiteboard doc to kind of sort through some of the TLS discussions. Because it's right now, it's scattered across multiple PR issue pages. And I know that it's, at least for me, it's like pretty hard to keep consistent what people are suggesting on each one. So
yeah,
I'll send
the Google Doc that's kind of like a metadata of the PRs and the issues, along with, like you said, being able to add comments and stuff to help us sort through. I just think that topic is there's just a lot to cover on that topic, but it's something that we need to make progress on because I feel like it's kind of holding things up.
Yeah, so I'll send something out. We'll do it, let's see, this Thursday, so it can't be Friday. So sometime next week, and then we'll just set up a regular office hours, which is not like, doesn't have an agenda, but basically people just show up, open the VC. I hope we can set this up with Zoom, but we'll figure out how to set it up. And then we can just kind of just like chat about stuff.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great for me.
Okay. So I'll send that out. I'll write that down somehow.
I think
really quick
TLS,
too.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Bowie, just on that topic really quick too, something you may want to consider as I think about Nick is, we may want to take that similar approach that we do with the weekly meetings where we alternate the times to make it easier on our Australian friends.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to send out an email so we can kind of work on when that will happen.
Thanks.
So I think for TLS, it's probably worth doing a similar exercise that what Nick's trying to do with the definitions is kind of write down the model in a really explicit way and get consensus around that, because I feel like what I do when I'm looking at the changes diffs to the API is kind of, oh, here's an API change, and you kind of have to reverse engineer the model from that. And because everyone who's reviewing it, I don't feel like we have a shared agreement on what the underlying model is, then everyone goes off on tangents and kind of asks for different things out of the PR, and then it becomes confusing for the conversation and for the person who's trying to get the PR reviewed.
Yes, I think that is kind of what we want to tackle in the next office hours, basically.
Yeah, James, to that point, on that virtual host issue, I did provide a link to a drawing I created. And before I started going too far down that path, I wanted to just kind of link it in there and get some feedback. And so if anyone has time just to kind of take a look at that, if it's headed in the right direction, I'll expand on that and start adding some docs and stuff like that to it as well. But again, I just didn't want to go too far down that path, and I'm not hitting the target,
Oh, cool. Could you add that to the notes or to the Slack? I haven't seen that link yet.
So there's an overall, like, I think since we had a bunch of discussion about it 2 sessions ago or something, there's like an overall issue about virtual hosts. And then I think everyone has been like cross-referencing with that.
Yeah, if my memory serves me correctly, it's issue 49.
There's also some use cases around TLS as well, which we should be referencing.
Yeah, so it would just be good to take all these issues, throw them in a doc so they're all in one place, and then we can kind of work through it in the office hour session.
This is sounding good.
Okay, so you'll see an email go out, communication go out about that. I just want to spend 10 minutes going through the project board, just draining some stuff that I think can be drained. So some of the in-progress stuff, I think automated protobuf generation, that one's fine. Create image repository, I think that one just needs to be followed up on. Initial conformance framework, this is basically anyone can kind of pick this one up. Different branch, okay, someone needs to pick that one up. So this one, singularize and expand Go docs for the host name. Oh, it's actually two things. I thought it was just singularize. Let's look at this one. So this is what the plural and singular. I think given that it keeps evolving and there have been issues filed around discussing wildcards, what do you guys think about just merging this one, given that it has some improvements on tightening up the language around what's allowed as a host name? And then we can always just make it plural at some point. I know that there's been some back and forth over, you know, how to use it in that way.
Yeah, I kind of tending to feel at this point that we do need to start, for the stuff where we're getting some sort of incremental value, we just need to start merging them and being a bit, because it's not like we're not declaring this anything close to done yet. So it doesn't matter if things aren't 100% right when they're merged. You know, it's not, there's currently absolutely no way that you could actually implement anything based on the spec we have, because there's big chunks missing, right? So it doesn't actually matter. It's not implementable at the moment. So it doesn't matter if we merge things in that are not final.
Yeah, we just need to make sure we're diligent about leaving breadcrumbs for the open issues.
Okay.
Agreed.
So I think this one is in that situation. So we can probably just make sure it's clean and then kind of merge it. And then all the links off of it will still be open. So they will need to be resolved. All right. Go to the next one. Add verify check that generated code is, oh, this is just the issue, but I think someone
There's
raised
a PR. Yeah.
Let's see.
This one. Yeah.
Yeah, is Yiblet. I'm assuming that's not the name. Yep. Are you on the call? No. Yeah. So this one, I feel like if anyone wants to take this one up or go forward with this one. But the general pattern we have is basically just containerize the build and just compare the files. So yeah, looking into the script is actually pretty complicated to understand. But if anyone wants to take this issue, that's fine. Okay, they're not on the call. Next. Let's see, what's the intention of controllers? So there's a bunch of just questions, which is hard to, like, you just answer them. And I feel bad closing them because then it's like, oh, I answer your question, like it's gone. So I added an FAQ section where we can just contain these things. So like, that's just FYI. But what do you guys think about this? Like, because otherwise the issue will just stay open forever.
I think that one should be closed. Yeah, like question answered. You know, if you have more questions, please, open a new thing.
Okay, all right, move on.
I like the idea of putting the answer in an FAQ so that people can go to the SIG website and find that.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Agreed.
Yeah. Anyways, this just adds the FAQ, which basically the answer. All right. Next one. Okay. So this one, typed local reference. So I think this one can go in apart from some comments here. The main gist was like, I think some of the fields were just not consistent with whatever Kubernetes had in core. And we would just like the names to be consistent because the user, when they're using it, will get kind of surprised that the name had changed.
You mean specifically the API group versus group field?
Yeah. Like I know it's like copy, but we should just keep it consistent for now.
Okay, I'm going to talk with David about that because we actually have a similar thing in the OpenShift API where we have groups of API group. I want to find out from David whether there's any reason in OpenShift we did. But
Yeah,
I
as
think
soon
it
as
does
we find out about that, I think we can just kind of merge this one and take care of it.
Is there an issue
merge
that
with-
talks about how a controller should handle errors around references? Like you referenced a type that I don't know about, that kind of thing?
Like API conventions or something specific to this?
Well, I mean, this is part of the, I mean, controllers are going to need to choose behavior around references, right? What do you do if a reference can't be resolved? What do you do if a reference references the wrong type? What do you do if it references the type you understand but don't expect in that context? So all these behaviors need to be defined.
Defined in general or defined for specific fields? Because in general, it might be pretty hard to have a very crisp like behavior, I guess.
It might
Whereas-
depend on the context, but you know, I think as a user of the API, you need to be able to understand what behavior is going to result from these references.
Yeah, that's true. Although I would feel like we would tackle this on a per field basis. Are you talking about it in general for references? Because that seems hard to me to kind of.
On a per field basis might make sense. I'm just asking about the issue in general. So it might make sense to say for a secret, this is how you handle the different scenarios for this particular reference field.
Yeah,
I
I think
think that-
practically, sorry, I think practically the simplest place would seem to be to put a thing in there saying for each, whenever you have a reference of some sort, part of the Go doc for that reference field says, if this reference is unavailable, you know, you must do this. If you know, or should, or you know, use that RFC language again to say these are the expected behaviors. Part of this API includes the contract about the expected behaviors if this is not valid for some reason. If you see what I'm saying, like, and if that's okay to have that, that makes sense to have that completely local to the thing as part of the Go doc for that field. But then we just need to make it a cultural thing that's what we do is when you have a reference field, part of the definition of the reference field is how do you handle how should someone implementing this API handle the ways that the reference field reference could go wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So to track that, we can maybe amend this with just a to-do to define the behavior for each one of these things that we're replacing right now. And then we'll handle it on a per specific instance basis. The main comment is I don't know if we can handle it generically. Like that'd be pretty hard.
Yeah, I feel like any generic thing would have to be like, in general, if you can't find the thing, then it should be a problem. But you can't be any more specific than that.
Okay, so
I think
those two things. One is, let's see what it means to have group versus API group, and then just keeping the names consistent. There was a suggestion to use aliases just to make it less verbose and less boilerplatey. And then this third one is we added to-dos for just defining the behavior. But since we haven't gotten to the specific fields yet, we'll just do it in that process. And then we should be good to go with this one. All right, next.
Sorry, I think I saw, Mikia, did you have anything to say there? You were flipping your mute on and off.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we could, in most, if not all cases, we can say, well, if this reference can't be resolved, then that means your listener, for example, is invalid, and that should be covered by a status condition. So if that sounds reasonable, I can, instead of just putting a to-do, I can write out, if this reference cannot be resolved, then that should cause this status condition to be set on your listener or your route or whatever. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, well, let's just update the PR and then we can take it there. It's also early, and we will probably do a scrub anyways at some point when the API is more stable.
All right, sounds good, thank you.
All right, continue gateway status, and let's see, consider naming, sorry, foo. So that should be covered by that one.
Yep.
Generated informers for non-controller runtime use.
So I have news here. There's there is an update on the ticket, but basically this is difficult to impossible without substantial changes to the upstream generators, thanks to the group having .kates.io, I think.
Oh, really?
Basically, when you run the generators for lister.gen and informer.gen, they decide that this is part of the core, and so the group is set to core, and you can't. There's no way to override it. Yeah. For the client gen, there actually is a specific set of things that you can get to override the group, but it's actually poorly documented and took me probably 3 or 4 hours of trial and error to make something that would work. But then, even then, other stuff inside that is kind of a bit funky and a bit weird. Like I actually think it's actually, although I like the idea to start with, in Contour we're not going to do this anymore. We're just going to use the dynamic client. So I think maybe I may sort of change this one to be right up, like make some examples on how you would use the dynamic client or something like that.
I see. Does it fix the problem if it's x-kates.io? Because Tim actually registered that domain name.
Right. I don't know. I could check and see. I don't. Yeah, I think like the problem here is that for people who are using like the generated codeway is kind of dying to dead anyway.
Yeah, that's what I had some conversation with some folks about it. So
yeah, like the queue builder is the right way to do this. It's much more supported. It's going to be supported more going forwards. You can consume the queue builder types to make them using the dynamic client. And maybe the better way to solve this is to just give some people some tips on moving to the dynamic client and then using the dynamic client instead. Basically, you don't need to move away from informers. The dynamic client can dynamically generate informers for you on the fly without you having to use the code gen to do it.
Okay. Well, it's just to update this one then. I think we might have to use x-kates.io. I'm just afraid of like clashing with other things that will assume you somehow like fall into the core.
Yeah. So it's reasonably likely that at some point something might have that problem. So if we need to change the groups, that's fine. We can do that. But now it's time to do it. Yeah,
okay. All right. I'll look into that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're almost out of time, or we're out of time. Is there any other? Verify for route. Okay, that's TLS. All right. Let's go to the next one, Nick.
Okay. So sorry. Yep. You've got this. Good. Okay. So yeah, I think there's been some good discussion on there already. I've tried to use like RFC style language here to make it as clear as possible about things. One of the things that I did have, I sort of put this around inside the Contour team first, and one of the points that was made as part of that discussion was that this first sentence sort of points up the fact that the gateway class as a name is kind of slightly problematic, right? Because if that's the best way you can define the name, then it says that maybe there's a better way to name it. I don't know what to do about that. I do think that we should possibly put a mental note for everybody to think like, I think gateway is probably the right name. There's been a bit of discussion there about it, but I don't know if gateway class is the right name. Anyway, that is a discussion for separately. But I think the important part here is actually, if you could scroll down to the bottom of the document, please. I actually think the most important part is to be able to have something like this, where there's like a sentence that describes what each is for. Then you have like a slightly more RFC thing that gives you a better idea of what that sentence means. And then you have like the actual sort of API spec that tells you here's how things work. And but having this sort of high level thing sort of is like, it functions as like I hate to use the businessism to an extent, but like a mission statement or something like that, where anytime you're confused about what we're doing, we can sort of go back to the agreed upon short definition and be like, does this match with that short definition? Do we need to change the short definition or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, this is useful. So gateway, I think that one, well, just to get a sense around the room, the virtual room, like I think gateway class, even though the name might be problematic, everyone kind of understands it.
Yeah, I agree that it is a bit problematic, but yeah, that I think everyone understands. I'm just putting a thing in there, and I think this is an important part of the idea of the gateway class, as it is for the ingress class for ingress v1, that you can put some config for your controller as part of the gateway class to sort of make it clear. I don't know if that's probably not the best words. Wordsmithing is not my strong suit. But yeah, I like this change. That is much better. I actually think that's better than enter the cluster, as you say. That it covers entering the cluster for the reverse proxy case, but it also covers the other cases. I think
like
that's the
we've
trickiest
had
part.
many discussions with internal teams who don't use Kubernetes, and they hear the word ingress. I'm talking about like ingress v1, and they're like, oh,
yeah. So
it's like coming into something, right? And then we're like, no, you can use it for internal something, and they're like, I'm confused.
Yeah.
So that was why I was
actually
kind of trying to stress, like, we should probably get rid of the directionality, especially since cluster networking is actually pretty heterogeneous across all the different Kubernetes deployments that we see. And like, once you start talking about like into or out of, people kind of go on this a little bit of a tangent. So anyway, that's where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah. No, I think that's completely fair. That the whole point of this thing is to be able to solve larger problems than just the reverse proxy use case, that ingress kind of works really well for. And that's fine, but that means that we definitely, it's really important. It's like super duper ridiculously important for us to do this exercise and sort of have some way that we can, and so I guess the key part for me here is that the difference is that the traffic can access services within the cluster is the important part. There is that it's implying that traffic has to do some sort of, has to pass through this point, right? And that's why it's called a gateway, is because the traffic has to pass through this point, and the gateway defines the point that the traffic has to pass through. Right. Whereas the routes define what happens to the traffic after it's passed through the gateway and where it goes after that.
Right.
So Nick, why didn't you just adopt the language from RFC descriptions of gateway? Was that, do you feel that didn't match the usage in some way?
I didn't have a chance to review it properly, man. That's all.
Okay.
Yeah, so I have no opinion on it yet. I haven't had a chance to have a look through it yet. But so I think
the thing is, we need to talk about this in terms of Kubernetes a little bit. And the RFC is HTTP focused, and I think it aligns with the RFC, but it may not be in a language that is necessarily like aligned with the Kubernetes side. So that's all. I think in terms of the RFC, I went over 2616, and I know there's like a successor one, but hopefully it's somewhat consistent with each other. And it seems like actually the two are aligned. And James, we had a conversation on Slack.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that they're aligned, which is kind of why I'm like, oh, we should just largely take that definition because it's already been wordsmithed over many years.
Yeah, we should reference it, but I would like to have the Kubernetes isms in there to ground it for folks coming from Kubernetes. And then we should definitely make sure that there's a connection with the RFC, so we can drop a reference in there.
Oh, so what I'm suggesting is copy paste their paragraph and then adjust it with any Kubernetes isms that we feel are useful. Basically, start with them and then tweak it.
Yeah, although from the RFC standpoint, I feel like the main focus of that is to distinguish a gateway from a proxy, where the proxy is like HTTP, using HTTP via the HTTP like proxy kind of protocol, and I guess it's like fairly generic where it talks about gateway. It says like gateway basically acts like an origin, and the users don't know about sort of the other.
Yeah, one of the distinctions that HTTP model makes between gateways and proxies is that basically a proxy is explicit and configured, and a gateway is implicit in the infrastructure. Like as a client, you can't tell that you're hitting a gateway. It's a network element that is not made explicit to the whoever is initiating the communication.
Yeah. So like I'd like the one sentence, and then we could probably tack on the RFC sort of as like a detailed thing. So I like where you are currently, Nick. Like this looks pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah. So, and I guess so that's sort of the idea, is that I want to be able to have like, what do these objects even mean? And then you have like just these one sentence definitions, and then how about some more detail or something like that, where you actually go into them with detail, and then you can have the API spec, and that way if you're just the person who's like, I don't even understand what the hell these people are talking about, you've got a place where you can go that says like, you know, I'm going to give you a basic understanding. And the other thing that's important, I think, is to have something that's like, I'm used to using Ingress for Kubernetes, and I need to understand why, like, what's the difference of why you do this, you know. And that's the other important thing, is to give people an easy way to take their mental map of Ingress and like munge it to be what we're talking about here. And that's why I had a couple of things in there to sort of say, you know, in Ingress, this is kind of like this. So people at least have a place to start to take their mental model of Ingress and blow it apart in the right way.
Okay, so like, what do we want to do with this? Because I think well, first let's get some opinions. Like, what do people feel about this?
Yeah.
I feel like the general direction is great, and the idea is useful. I think we just need to iterate on some specific phrasing.
Dane.
Anyone else?
No, I think this is great, and I think, as James just mentioned, you know, small tweaks, but I would like to see this eventually live in the documentation. I don't know, maybe under concepts, because it is nice for someone that's new to the project to start at the highest level and then just work their way down into details. And to me, this is that starting point.
Okay, so I think like maybe we can use this doc and then just kind of I like the in summary especially, and then maybe we can even open a PR with just the in summary and throw it in the concept somewhere.
Yeah, I'll have a think about what I'll do. And so my idea is that, like, I will open a PR to the concepts document with at least the in summary and maybe a couple of other bits, and then we'll go, and then we can talk more on that PR, and we can come back here if the PR is too unwieldy. But I think at least getting the summary part in will really help, because I think that like I said, it's good to be able to have that one sentence thing as sort of a way to come back to, but it also means that, you know, for people who are sort of only watching the project a little bit, then we've got a way to be like, you know, if they say something that's like against this sort of agreed on concept, then we can be like, well, you need to go read the API concepts again. Sorry, but like that's not what we're intending to do with this.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, with the intent of sort of making it easier to make it so that we don't spend everybody's time having to have an argument about what a paper is.
Yeah. Okay. So like, I think then we should just expect that PR from you, Nick.
Yeah, I'll try and work on that this afternoon, Australia time. I should be able to get something pretty quick, hopefully.
All right, cool. Yeah, I put something down there, just like it's the ugliest definition, but you know, it's kind of what it does. So, anyways, but I think you've captured it in a nicer way.
The document's useful. It gives a nice model. My concern is that it might be a little bit too simple when we get into things like TLS, where that really muddies things up. That kind of confuses the separation between gateway routes. What does it mean for traffic to access services?
It's actually one of the reasons that I wanted to do this first before we got too deep into the TLS thing, is because I think doing this exercise will help with at least, you know, if we are muddying the waters in because we need to for TLS, that we can at least call out, yes, we know that we are muddying the distinction between these things but we're doing it for these reasons and like this, and then you add that back into the API concepts and say, TLS is a big thing here, and TLS does break this thing a bit, and here's how we deal with it. You know, and that, but if we have this place to start from, then it makes it easier for us all to talk about TLS as well, because we can agree there.
Yeah, so I think that's the main point of me writing the ugly one, is that we shouldn't forget that it's like a UX for the users, and like we will muddy it to make it better for the users. So it's not like if something is like it has to be pure and then but it like it's just super awkward, then we will have to break those places. Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Let's see. Oh. So I was going to talk about gateway versus versus HTTP route with respect to TLS, but maybe the office hours might be more productive. We could kind of talk through some of the issues that are raised. At least what I'm seeing is like, A, where does TLS live? Does it live on the gateway versus the route? In terms of consistency, I think that's covered in the virtual host issue. I think, James, you were raising a bunch of security concerns in terms of consistency between the SNI and the host header.
So let me back up a second. I think the distinction that is sort of implicit in the gateway versus the HTTP route, I think that's a little bit misleading. So gateway is logically a single network element that presents as an endpoint to a client, right? And that network element might be a HTTP proxy, it might terminate TLS or whatever. So the gateway and what we configure as HTTP routes, they're all really part of the same element, right?
Yeah.
It's a single
I mean,
logical
yes, most embodiments,
logical network
it's just
element,
like one thing
right?
from the user's perspective.
So when you say, anyway, so back to the SNI thing, is that in general, I think there's a pretty strong expectation that a host name is the same host name up and down the protocol stack, and that there's the protocol layers are aligned in that regard. The way the current API is spec'd is you have a collection of certificates over here on the gateway object, and then you have a collection of hosts over there on HTTP host route objects, and there's no API linkages between them. Right?
Although,
So,
I mean, what it might be, you could consider it to be a policy thing because, for example, one implementation could just say, I terminate the SNI, and I also crack the HTTP, and look, like they don't match. It's like an invalid request, right?
but you can't enforce anything, right? But I think the API should be structured to do the right thing, right? If you
But how
get, as soon as you,
the question would be like, doesn't that just disallow any invalid usages, except for default certificates, which admittedly is
if it's an invalid usage, then yeah, it should be disallowed. The structure of the API should make invalid usage difficult to impossible.
But what I'm saying is like, is it orthogonal to the API perhaps? Because you can tell from a request itself whether or not it's consistent, irrespective of even the shape of the API. Is maybe I'm missing.
Okay, so you have you're a user and you're configuring a host, right? What you want in general is to say, here's my host name, and here's the certificate bundle that I was allocated for this host name. So I'm giving you the host name and the certificate bundle, right?
Right.
But what the API says is, over here there's a whole pile of certificates, and over here there's a whole pile of host names, and then you do what you want with them. So that kind of API construction doesn't encourage you to do what to instantiate the model that the user of the API kind of wants and is thinking about. For example, how do you make sure that you're doing TLS client termination on the right certificates and that's going to the right host? That's like a purely implementation detail. On the implementation side, if someone updates the set of certificates on a document on a gateway, then how do I know as an implementation which HTTP host routes I should use for those? Well, I have to actually look at the certificates. I have to go and parse the certificates and fish the SNI out of those in order to configure the
SANs.
underlying. Yeah, sorry, you're right. The SANs. I have to look at the SANs to actually figure that out.
Yeah.
Whereas
So
if we structure the API so that there's a binding, there's some sort of relationship between the certificate and the route that it's supposed to be used for, then that information is part of the API, and it also implies that like there's always not always, in the larger use case, there will usually be a relationship between the certificate bundle and the host name. Like, there are some cases where it's not, but most of the time, and I feel like they're trying to design their API to be, most of the time, the easy use cases are the ones that the API supports the best.
Correct.
It's definitely true that, so for it's partially my fault. When I ported it over from Ingress, I accidentally left out the hostname thing. Because in Ingress, there is a list of host names associated with certificates. However, from an API perspective, I don't think there was any validation to make sure that those lists of host names actually are valid SANs in the certificates themselves, which I think is the stronger guarantee that you wanted to make. Is that true? Because if you don't look at the certificate, then
that would be, so the way I would express that is here, what I would do is the API gives you a structure that lets you do that and encourages you to associate a certificate with some kind of route, with something that encourages an association of a certificate with something, some policy, right? And as a quality of implementation, the spec can say an implementation must do these kinds of validations, or should do these kinds of validations. But
yeah, like that, there I have less knowledge about who would not want that validation. Because I can totally see just saying, hey, if you show up with an SNI of foo and then your host is like bar, it's like boom, like, what are you doing?
There is the one use case that I have seen where it's actually a good thing that you want that is you can actually use it's called domain fronting. You can use a domain that fronts for another domain to evade like censorship restrictions and stuff like that. So basically you can have a host that's set up that will accept that. Basically you give it a cert for domainfront.com, and then your host actually asks for facebook.com or something like that, and you happen to be somewhere where Facebook is blocked, and it will handle all that shenanigans for you. So that is one use case. I do think that those use cases are unusual enough that it's okay to have it be that by default this is all bound together, and you got to jump through some hoops to make that happen, because those cases are pretty unusual. I also think that is.
Sorry, I was going to say. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, and the last thing that's really important to be clear here is that this only arises in the HTTP, in the one where you are doing routing on HTTP at the gateways, inside the gateway's network point. If you are doing SNI for TCP, and forwarding the TCP connection through to somewhere else, this is not an issue that you need to worry about, because there's no host information, right? You are only routing on the SNI then. So it's only when you're doing layer
the host is a header that's meaningful across two protocol layers, and they're not like coordinated. Okay,
so there's two issues here. So if you're looking at SNI and then you're forwarding the TCP, then you're not presenting a certificate, so there's no association that you need to worry about.
Yes.
And the thing, and domain fronting is the same as SNI bypass. It just depends on your perspective of it. Will depend on what audience you're in, right? If you're an eyeball network trying to control your traffic, you're like, SNI bypass is terrible. It's I really hate it. It's messing with me. If you're, some kind of other operator trying to get access to useful things, and you might say, well, domain fronting is a really useful technique and it has all these legitimate uses. So
yeah, I think that's fairly rare, although we should ask for folks who wanted, I would like to collect the use cases on that side.
So I think the biggest one that I can think of where it is a big where it is a big problem is if your TLS config bundle also includes client certificates. So if your TLS client config bundle also includes client certificate validation, then you're using that TLS negotiation as part of your authentication. And so if you have two bundles associated with a single gateway, you can actually use the less secure bundle to authenticate to the gateway, and then use the host header to get to the service that's supposed to have the client authentication, right? So you can bypass the, you can bypass the Yeah,
Sure.
so that's where it's super important.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that's
No, that
and
makes
that's
sense. I think
And it's
as-
totally reasonable to, like a lot of sites will have different verification policies for different host names. So like, oh, iTunes.apple.com, for example, uses EV certificates, right?
Oh.
So they don't want you to get to iTunes if you use some other kind of validation certificate.
Right. I'm just thinking in terms of what this translates to in the API, because would it translate to that you should always, if you move it into, if you have TLS bundles in HTTP route level where you're describing the host, is it going to be an invalid HTTP route unless you have some special config, if we wanted to handle that case, to have a mismatched SAN host, or like what kind of policy would go there? Another piece of it would be, is it, again, like barring some extra config, that it's invalid, that is always the expectation that routing will always have SNI and the host kind of match. Like, I'm just trying to think, because what it sounds like to me is that we can make certain configs invalid, and then do some checking, but sort of like the handling of this association still depends kind of on the implementation doing it. We can make it harder for people to shoot themselves in the foot, but still there has to be some kind of validation going on.
But it depends on your model, right? I think the model is not the model is not that these things have to. Okay, let me go back. You have a service, right? You have a service that has a name. That name is in the certificates. A client comes in, it presents it presents a SNI, and it says, and that SNI is like, this is the name of the service that I want. Right?
Sure.
So, and you connect them up. Now, if this client comes in and you say, and it says, well, this is the name of the service I want, then you get to that service and you get the certificates for that service, whatever they are, right?
Okay. Are you talking about where the gateway is serving the certificates or not?
And that's kind of it, because you have this logical notion of a service, right, which is a network name which provides some kind of functionality. And this logical idea of this network service name is, you know, the endpoint, and that's what the certificates are associated with. The certificates are not associated with the thing that the client sent you. They're associated with this logical concept of a service.
The Kubernetes service or the HTTP route?
He's using service in a more general sense,
like a more
than the
generic
Kubernetes service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm using service in the sense of what the names mean at TLS layer.
Okay.
So I think for the API, in my mind, the important part is just that there's a way to that there needs to be a closer binding than what there is right now between the TLS config and the which currently resides on the listener and the routes. Maybe maybe it's something to do with making the routes be like, you know, the only thing that I can think of right now off the top of my head is that maybe there are two places where you can put routes. One where you don't care about what the where you don't have you don't care about this problem, and one where you do. And if you put the routes under the listener, then they sort of bind much more tightly to it. I don't know, but like the important part here is the binding between the route and the listener needs to be like, because the TLS stuff is a property of the listener, definitely, because that, you know, you need that as part of the, if you're listening on this port, these are the TLS things that are valid for this port. That is because that happens at the lower layer. Maybe the right answer is then that if you're doing HTTP routes that require TLS that go under this thing, they need to go on this thing. That doesn't let you then though specify the TLS bundle as part of the HTTP route. That means that the HTTP route does not contain the information about the TLS bundle. And so that the thing there though is that if we want the TLS bundle to live at the gateway level, then that necessarily means that the TLS bundle can't live at the HTTP route level. the place where I think that's important is for people who don't want. It means that if you want to be, as a developer who just wants to be able to create a thing to expose my service, I then need to create two things, right? Like I need to create the gateway and the thing. I mean, maybe I don't, but maybe a controller can create that on my behalf. But like that, the idea is that in order to specify my thing, I need the two things, and as we just need to be super clear about which things live where, and that if we're going to say TLS is a property of the listener, that's fine. But then we just need to be super clear that TLS is not a property of the HTTP route, right? Like and if that's the case, then the binding should be that, it's really tightly bound at the listener level. The HTTP route is bound to the listener rather than to the gateway.
Yeah, that was one of the earlier configurations. Although I want to understand this a little bit more because maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing sorry, you go, Dan.
I was going to say, I did recently submit a PR that I think is relatively in line with what we're talking about here. And James, I appreciate you taking a look at the first iteration of it and made some big changes to it since I got your feedback the other day. But in general, the PR states, all TLS config does live in the gateway. I think that's the right place to do all the TLS config. But currently there's a TLS listener that you specify any TLS related configuration there. And I basically changed it to a more generalized TLS config. And so from a gateway standpoint, now when we actually associate routes, it's not just a reference to a backend object like an HTTP route, but it's that backend object plus configuration aspects of that route. So it would be, well, let me list my routes that I associate to this gateway, and for each route, here's the kind of termination I want to do, either edge or let it pass through, along with the TLS config that I would use for this route if I need to create a backend TLS connection to it. And so I think that's kind of in line with what we're talking about. And so if if everyone gets a chance, take a look at that and let me know what you think.
I see. So the key here is that for, but like Damien, if you had a selector in there, like how would you, how would you control this sort of association in some sense?
Yeah, so I think with the selector,
there's nothing to prevent you from creating a situation that's sort of similar. Like the binding, if HTTP, if the route you link to is a free variable and the TLS is somewhat of a free variable, like I guess we would mandate some sort of validation that they line up somehow.
Yeah, I mean, with the selector-based approach, I think it's definitely easier with just specifying a route
over time,
right? But for the selector-based approach, I would think that we would say, okay, here are the routes to associate based on these labels, and here's the TLS config for all of these backends that match up with these labels. Probably need to think through it a little bit more to see how that would actually be realized. But
yeah, I would like to, maybe James, I'll ping you offline to kind of understand, maybe I'm missing something with respect to like what kind of guarantees you want, or is it more we want to funnel users towards a safe way to describe things?
So here's another example. If I say I have a host name, I have a service, and my service wants to only accept, and I have a service and I have my own CA, right? And I only want to deal with people who are, part of that CA. So if I don't have a binding between what we're calling HTTP host route and a certificate bundle, then you can come in on any old certificate name and get to me, which isn't what
Right, but would you, the idea there would be that, would you create another gateway to do that separation, or you would keep it on the same gateway? So like that's where we kind of need to work out a couple of examples with respect to the API itself.
Oh, interest. Well, okay. So I don't think, no. Okay. So gateway, I think in many instantiations, you don't create. So I think for a cloud provider, maybe you can create gateways on the fly. For something like Contour, which is deployed as part of your cluster, that seems really kind of problematic, because at least for us, like there's an Envoy daemon set, which is kind of largely there.
Right. Yeah. So that would be good to understand that aspect of it, I think, because I think there's like ways where you can do the isolation, but what if you isolate at the resource level versus you have one gateway that maps to your infrastructure, and then that requires isolation within the resource itself. It would be great to like kind of sort of write that out, so we know kind of why, for example, it is necessary to do isolation at a particular level. I'm not saying that it sounds like this is something that we should definitely tackle in this API. Just kind of understand like the space of it.
I hadn't really considered about trying to make, trying to deploy something which has a one-to-one relationship between a gateway and an HTTP route. That seems kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So let's we're like over time. Sorry, everyone, it's keeping you around. So I think we should definitely take these topics to the office hours. Lots of interesting conversations. And then, of course, we can just keep discussing it on Slack. Sorry for who put the last one. I think we should move it to the next meeting. Cross namespace use cases. I don't know who put that one on there.
Yeah, I play. No problem.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
Yeah, I don't think we have time to get to it, but we'll put it on the agenda for next time, so we make sure we get to it. And I'll send out the invite for the follow-up on TLS, which is a fun topic.
Sure, thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.